The morning of July 19th, 1945, arrived with the kind of oppressive Virginia heat that made even breathing feel like labor. Inside the barracks of Fort Getty, Rhode Island, 61 German prisoners of war sat rigid on wooden benches, their eyes fixed on a chalkboard that held words in a language most had been taught to despise. An American instructor stood before them, chalk in hand, forming letters that looked alien and uncomfortable. Cat, dog, home, freedom. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Sergeant Klaus Brenner, 23 years old, formerly of Rommel's Afrika Korps, stared at these simple words and felt something crack inside his chest. Not from anger, not from defiance, but from a humiliation so profound it bordered on grief. He had commanded a tank crew across the North African desert. He had survived the inferno of Alamein. He had watched his closest friends burn alive when British shells penetrated their armor. And now he sat like a child in a schoolroom, struggling to pronounce words a 5-year-old American could say without thinking. The instructor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the patient voice of someone who had taught elementary school before the war, pointed to the word cat. He pronounced it slowly, his mouth exaggerating the shapes. The prisoners stared back in silence, some with suspicion, others with barely concealed rage, a few with something that might have been curiosity, though they would never admit it aloud. This was not supposed to happen. When Klaus and his comrades had been captured near Tunis in May of 1943, they had braced for brutality. They had heard the stories, passed between soldiers in whispers during the long nights in their bunkers. The Americans would torture them. The British would starve them. They would be worked to death in labor camps, their bodies discarded like the refuse of a failed empire. Instead, they had been loaded onto Liberty ships with meals that contained more calories than they had seen in months. They had been transported in Pullman train cars across a country so vast and undamaged it seemed to exist in another reality entirely. And now they sat in classrooms, being offered education as though they were students rather than enemies. The absurdity of it made Klaus want to laugh. Or weep. He was no longer certain which emotion was appropriate. According to records maintained by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, over 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in 700 camps across the United States between 1942 and 1946. Of these, approximately 360,000 participated in some form of educational programming, with English language instruction forming the cornerstone of American re-education efforts. The contrast was deliberate. The United States had decided that the most effective weapon against Nazi ideology was not punishment, but exposure to an alternative way of thinking. The instructor moved to the next word, dog. He held up a small picture book, the kind used to teach American children their first words. A brown dog with floppy ears stared out from the page, its tongue hanging in what looked like a smile. Several of the prisoners shifted uncomfortably. Friedrich Weber, a former schoolteacher from Munich who sat in the front row, felt his throat tighten. His own children had owned books like this, picture books with simple words and bright illustrations, books that had been burned when the neighborhood watch commander decided they contained un-German influences. The instructor noticed Friedrich's reaction. He walked closer, holding out the book. "Would you like to hold it?" he asked in slow, careful English. Friedrich did not understand the words, but he understood the gesture, the offering, of something small and harmless, the implicit trust that he would not tear it apart or spit on it. Slowly, as though reaching for something sacred, Friedrich extended his hands and took the book. His fingers traced the image of the dog. The paper was thick, sturdy, designed to withstand the rough handling of small children. On the opposite page, the word DOG appeared in large, friendly letters. Beneath it, a simple sentence, "The dog runs." Friedrich's vision blurred. He told himself it was the heat, the exhaustion, the disorientation of captivity, but he knew it was something else. It was the sudden, overwhelming recognition that he was being treated like a human being capable of learning, rather than an animal to be penned and forgotten. Klaus watched Friedrich hold the picture book with trembling hands and felt his own defences weaken. The instructor moved through the lesson with methodical patience. House, tree, sky. With each word came a picture. With each picture came a story. So simple it bordered on the infantile. The house is big. The tree is tall. The sky is blue. These were not the words of conquest or ideology. These were the building blocks of communication, stripped of politics and propaganda. They were the fundamental tools of understanding, and they were being offered freely to men who had, only months before, been trying to kill the people now teaching them. The heat in the barracks grew unbearable as midday approached. Sweat dripped down faces and soaked through the prisoners' uniforms. But the lesson continued. The instructor introduced basic verbs. Walk, run, eat, sleep. He acted them out, his movements exaggerated and almost comic. A few prisoners permitted themselves small smiles. Laughter would have been too much, would have implied acceptance, but smiles were involuntary, brief cracks in the armor of resentment. By the time the morning session ended, Klaus's head throbbed with the effort of memorizing foreign sounds. English was not like German. The rules seemed arbitrary, contradictory. Words that looked similar sounded completely different. Sounds that seemed identical were spelled in incomprehensible ways. It was as though the language itself had been designed to frustrate logical minds, and yet there was something compelling about the challenge, something that pulled at a part of Klaus he thought had died in the desert. That evening, as the prisoners returned to their barracks, whispers filled the space between bunks. Some men mocked the lesson openly. "Treating us like children," one snarled, "as though simple words can make us forget who we are." Others remained silent, but Klaus noticed them mouthing the English words under their breath. Cat, dog, tree. Testing the shapes on their tongues, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. Friedrich sat on his bunk, holding the memory of that picture book in his mind. He thought of his own children, whom he had not seen in 3 years. His daughter Liesel would be 8 now. His son Martin would be 6. Were they still alive? Had the bombing raids that obliterated German cities spared his family, or had they joined the millions of civilians whose names would never be recorded, whose deaths would be listed simply as collateral damage in the statistics of total war? The question haunted him, but for a moment, holding that simple children's book, he had allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where he might return home, where he might sit with Liesel and Martin and teach them English words from picture books, where the language of their former enemies might become a bridge to understanding rather than a weapon of conquest. It was a foolish hope, he knew that, but it was a hope nonetheless, and hope was a dangerous thing to permit in a prisoner of war camp. The next morning, more prisoners attended the English class. Word had spread through the camp that the Americans were serious about this education program, that it was not a trick or a punishment, but a genuine offering. Still, suspicion remained thick in the air. Otto Schneider, a former SS officer who had managed to hide his affiliation, sat in the back row with his arms crossed, his face carved into an expression of contempt. He watched the instructor with the eyes of someone evaluating an enemy's weakness. The instructor seemed aware of Otto's hostility, but he did not react to it. Instead, he brought out more picture books. These ones were slightly more advanced. Simple stories about families and farms and animals, stories without politics or ideology, just the basic narratives of human life. He read one aloud in English, then in halting German, then in English again. The story was about a boy and his dog. The boy lost his dog. The boy searched for his dog. The boy found his dog. They were happy. It was the simplest possible narrative. Yet Klaus found himself leaning forward, following along with an intensity that surprised him. When the instructor finished, he asked in German, "Who can tell me what happened in the story?" Men who had sworn only yesterday that they would never cooperate with American propaganda now volunteered to demonstrate their comprehension. Friedrich spoke first, his voice hesitant but clear. The boy lost his friend. He looked everywhere. He did not give up. In the end, he found what he had lost. The instructor smiled. "Yes, exactly." Then he added, "In English," and Friedrich repeated it phrase by phrase. The boy did not give up. He kept looking, He found his friend. The simple moral of a children's story had become a lesson in persistence, in hope, in the possibility of finding what was lost. Klaus wondered if the instructor knew how deeply those words would cut. How many of the prisoners in that room had lost everything? Friends, family, homes, countries. They had fought for a cause that had consumed millions and left nothing but ruins. And now they sat in a barracks, in Rhode Island, learning English from picture books, trying to imagine a future where something could be found again. The education program at Fort Getty was part of a larger American initiative that historians would later call the Intellectual Diversion Program, officially sanctioned by the Prisoner of War Special Programs Division. The summer of 1944, it aimed to counteract Nazi indoctrination through exposure to democratic principles, American literature, and basic English language instruction. The program was careful to avoid direct propaganda, which would have violated the Geneva Convention. Instead, it relied on the simple power of education itself, on the radical idea that knowledge could dismantle hatred more effectively than force. At Fort Getty, the 60-day program combined English language instruction with courses in American history, German history, and the principles of democratic government. But the English classes formed the foundation, because language was not merely a tool for communication, it was a gateway to different ways of thinking. Every word a prisoner learned in English created a small opening in the wall of ideology that had been constructed around his mind. By October of 1945, over 26,000 German prisoners would cycle through the accelerated programs at Fort Getty and Fort Eustis, Virginia. They would study from picture books and simple primers. They would practice pronunciation until their throats ached. They would struggle with irregular verbs and incomprehensible idioms, and many of them would weep. Klaus first saw a prisoner cry during the third week of instruction. It was Hans Dietrich, a quiet man from Hamburg, who rarely spoke in class. The instructor had brought in a collection of American picture books donated by local schools. These were worn books, their pages soft from countless readings by children who had long since outgrown them. Hans was given a book called The Little Engine That Could. The instructor read it aloud in English, his voice taking on the different characters. The little engine that repeated, "I think I can, I think I can," as it climbed an impossible hill. When the reading finished, Hans sat very still, staring at the illustration of the little engine finally reaching the top of the mountain. His shoulders began to shake. At first, Klaus thought he was laughing. But then he saw the tears streaming down Hans's face, silent tears that he made no effort to wipe away. The instructor quietly placed a hand on Hans's shoulder and moved on with the lesson, giving him the dignity of private grief in a public space. Later, in the barracks, Klaus asked Hans what had happened. Why had a children's story affected him so deeply? Hans looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "My son," he said quietly. His name was Peter. He loved that story. My wife read it to him every night before bed. "I think I can, I think I can." He would say it over and over, climbing the stairs to his bedroom, carrying his toy train. Hans's voice broke. The bombing of Hamburg. July 1943. Operation Gomorrah, they called it. Fire everywhere. Temperatures hot enough to melt asphalt. My wife and Peter, they were in the basement shelter. They suffocated from the smoke before the fire even reached them. I was on the Eastern Front. I did not even know they were dead until 6 months later. Klaus had no words. What could anyone say to such loss? Hans continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I had forgotten that story. I thought I had buried everything from before. But hearing it again, in English, in this place, it was like Peter was speaking to me, telling me I cannot give up, that I must keep going. I think I can. I think I can. He wiped his face roughly. It is foolish. A children's book. But it is the first time I have felt anything since they died. The power of simple stories, Klaus realized, was that they bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the heart. The Americans had not given them complex political treatises or philosophical arguments about democracy. They had given them picture books, Stories about dogs and trains and boys who did not give up. And somehow, these simple narratives had accomplished what force never could. They had reminded the prisoners that beneath their uniforms, beneath their ideology, beneath their wounds and hatred, they were still human beings capable of feeling, of learning, of hoping. As the weeks progressed, the English classes became the focal point of camp life. More prisoners volunteered for the program. Even some of the hardline Nazis, the ones who had initially refused to participate, began slipping into the back of the classroom. They told themselves they were gathering intelligence on American propaganda techniques. But Klaus suspected they stayed because the lessons offered something they had not experienced in years. Structure without violence, challenge without humiliation. The possibility of transformation. Friedrich, the former schoolteacher, became one of the most dedicated students. He stayed after class, practicing pronunciation with the instructor, asking questions about grammar and usage. The instructor began bringing him more advanced books, still simple, still illustrated, but with longer sentences and more complex vocabulary. One day, he brought Friedrich a copy of Charlotte's Web, a book about a pig and a spider and the power of friendship. It was far beyond Friedrich's current English abilities, but the instructor said, "You will read this someday. When you do, think of me. Think of this classroom. Remember that enemies can become friends when they take the time to understand each other's words." Friedrich held the book as though it were made of gold. "I will read it," he promised in halting English. "I will remember." That evening, he wrote in the journal the camp allowed prisoners to keep. "Today, I received a gift more valuable than anything I have owned in years. A book, in English. It is too difficult for me now. But I will learn. I will read every word, and when I return to Germany, if I return to Germany, I will teach others what I have learned here. That language is not a weapon, but a bridge. That the Americans, whom we were taught to hate, have shown me more kindness as their prisoner than my own leaders showed me as their soldier." The tears that Klaus had witnessed in Hans became more common as the weeks passed. Men wept over the simplest things, a picture of a farmhouse that reminded them of home, a simple English phrase that captured a feeling they thought they could no longer access, the pronunciation of their own names in an American accent, which somehow made them feel seen as individuals rather than as nameless enemies. The instructors handled these moments with quiet dignity. They did not comment on the tears. They simply continued the lessons, allowing the men to feel without judgment. 1. Instructor. A woman named Margaret Anderson, who had been an elementary school teacher in Virginia before volunteering for the war effort, brought her own children's books from home. These were the books her sons had loved before they grew too old for picture stories. She read them aloud with the same gentle voice she had used with her boys, and Klaus watched grown men, hardened soldiers who had survived the brutality of war, sit transfixed like children hearing their first bedtime story. Margaret noticed Klaus's intense focus. After class one day, she approached him with a small book in her hand. "This was my son Thomas's favourite," she said in simple English, speaking slowly so he could understand. "He is in the Navy now, fighting in the Pacific. I do not know if I will see him again, but I want you to have this." She pressed the book into his hands. It was Goodnight Moon, a simple story about a rabbit saying goodnight to everything in his room before falling asleep. Klaus looked at the book, then at Margaret. "Why?" he managed to ask in broken English. "Why give this to me? My son could be fighting your countrymen right now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Because you are someone's son too. Because your mother, wherever she is, wants you to come home. Because this war has taken too many boys from too many mothers. If I can teach you words that help you rebuild your country as something better, as something peaceful, then maybe Thomas's fighting will have meant something." Klaus could not respond. His English failed him, but he held the book to his chest and nodded. That night, by the dim light of the barracks, he slowly worked through the pages of Goodnight Moon. Goodnight Room. Goodnight Moon. Goodnight Cow jumping over the moon. The words were absurd. The story was nothing. But the act of reading them, of speaking them quietly to himself, felt like a form of prayer. A prayer for his own mother in Dresden, if she still lived. A prayer for Margaret's son Thomas in the Pacific. A prayer for all the mothers and sons separated by this catastrophic war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By November of 1945, the program at Fort Getty was processing hundreds of prisoners each month. The war in Europe had ended. Germany lay in ruins, divided among the occupying powers, and German POWs in American camps faced an uncertain future. Repatriation would come eventually, but to what? To cities that no longer existed? To families that might be dead? To a country that had been utterly transformed by defeat? The English lessons offered something unexpected in this liminal space between captivity and return. They offered purpose, direction, the possibility that what they learned here might serve them in whatever came next. The instructors began incorporating more complex materials as the prisoners' English improved. They introduced newspapers, selected carefully to avoid inflammatory content, but to provide exposure to American discourse. They brought in films, chosen for their educational value rather than propaganda. They organized debates where prisoners could practice speaking English while discussing neutral topics, safe subjects like agriculture, science, the weather, not politics, never politics. But through these discussions, something subtle happened. The prisoners began to hear themselves think differently, to express ideas in a language that did not carry the weight of Nazi rhetoric, to imagine possibilities beyond the ideological certainties they had been taught. Klaus found himself looking forward to the English classes with an intensity that surprised him. He who had once been so certain of his cause, so committed to the idea of German supremacy, now eagerly absorbed vocabulary words and grammar rules from his captors. The transformation was not sudden. It was not a dramatic conversion. It was slow, gradual, like water wearing away stone. Each word learned was a small erosion of certainty. Each simple story read was a quiet challenge to the narratives he had believed. The transformation that began with picture books and simple words accelerated as winter approached. The camp at Fort Getty took on a different character in the cold months. The barbed wire looked starker against bare trees. The breath of prisoners and guards alike formed clouds in the freezing air. But inside the classrooms, something warm was growing, a quiet revolution of the mind that no amount of wire or watchtowers could contain. Friedrich Weber had progressed beyond basic vocabulary. He now read simple paragraphs, stumbling over pronunciation, but grasping meaning with increasing confidence. The instructor, recognizing his dedication, began giving him books to keep, not just to borrow for the lesson, but to own, to take back to his bunk and read by whatever light he could find. These books became Friedrich's most precious possessions. He wrapped them carefully in spare cloth to protect them from the dampness of the barracks. He read them again and again until he could recite passages from memory. One December morning, the instructor brought something different to class. Instead of picture books, he carried a stack of thin volumes, primers, he called them in English, books specifically designed to teach reading to those just beginning their journey with language. They contained short stories, simple dialogues, exercises in comprehension. But unlike children's picture books, these primers treated their readers as adults, as people capable of complex thought even if their vocabulary remained limited. Klaus received his primer with trembling hands. On the first page, a simple declaration. You are learning English. English is the language of freedom and democracy. As you learn to speak English, you will learn to think in new ways. You will discover that the world is larger than you were told. That truth is more complex than propaganda. That peace is possible even between former enemies. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were propaganda, though certainly they carried ideological weight, but because they were true. He had already felt the shift happening inside his mind, the way English words created space for thoughts that German, as he had been taught to use it under the Reich, did not permit. In German, he thought in terms of orders and obedience, strength and weakness, victory or death. In English, even his halting, incomplete English, He found himself thinking in questions, in possibilities, in the conditional tense that allowed for uncertainty and exploration. Otto Schneider, the former SS officer, threw his primer on the floor. "This is poison," he hissed in German. "They are trying to remake us, to make us forget who we are, what we fought for." Several other prisoners nodded in agreement. But Klaus noticed that, even as Otto spoke, his eyes lingered on the pages of the discarded book. Even resistance, it seemed, required knowing what one was resisting. The instructor did not force Otto to pick up the primer. He simply continued the lesson. "Today," he announced in slow, clear English, "we will learn to write our own stories, not repeat stories from books, but tell our own stories." He distributed paper and pencils. "Write 3 sentences in English," he instructed, "about anything you want, your family, your home, your dreams, anything." The room fell silent except for the scratch of pencils on paper. Klaus stared at the blank page before him. 3 sentences, about anything. The freedom was paralyzing. He had spent years in an army where every word, every thought, had to align with approved doctrine, where deviation meant punishment or death. And now he was being asked to choose his own words, to express his own thoughts, in the language of his captors, no less. Finally, he began to write, forming English letters with painstaking care. "I had a brother. His name was Matthias. He died at Stalingrad." 3 simple sentences. Subject, verb, object. The most basic construction the English language allowed, and yet those 3 sentences contained an entire universe of grief. Matthias had been 20 years old when he froze to death in the ruins of that cursed city. He had written Klaus one final letter, its pages arriving 3 months after his death. In it, Matthias had described the cold that made men's fingers snap off like icicles, the hunger that drove soldiers to eat their leather belts, the absolute certainty that he would never see Germany again. Klaus looked at his 3 English sentences and felt tears burn behind his eyes. He had written Matthias's epitaph in the language of the nation that had helped destroy Germany. Was that betrayal? Or was it something else? Was it perhaps a way of ensuring that Matthias's death would be remembered in a language that would survive, in a world that would continue long after the Reich had turned to dust? Friedrich had written his 3 sentences with greater fluency. "I was a teacher before the war. I taught children to read and write. I want to teach again." Hans Dietrich, who had wept over "The Little Engine That Could," had written, "My son liked trains. I think of him every day. English is hard, but I will learn." Even Otto Schneider, who had thrown his primer on the floor, had eventually retrieved it and written something. Klaus could not see what he had written, but the fact that he had written anything at all felt significant. The instructor collected the papers without reading them aloud. "These are yours," he said. "Your words, your stories. Keep them. Remember them. Someday, when you are home, you will write more stories. Better stories. Stories of what you will build in the future, not what was destroyed in the past." According to documentation preserved in the National Archives, the re-education program at Fort Getty achieved remarkable results. Of the prisoners who completed the 60-day course, over 70% demonstrated significant shifts in political attitudes. More importantly, over 85% maintained their English language skills after repatriation and used them to facilitate communication during the Allied occupation of Germany. Many became translators, administrators, teachers. They formed a bridge between the occupying forces and the devastated German population, helping to rebuild a nation from ruins. But these statistics, impressive as they were, could not capture what happened in individual hearts. The quiet moments when a hardened soldier realized he was crying over a children's book, the instant when a former Nazi officer found himself laughing at his own mispronunciation, the laughter genuine and unforced, the gradual dawning that language could be used to build rather than destroy, to connect rather than divide. By January of 1946, Klaus had progressed to reading short novels in English. The instructor had given him a copy of The Call of the Wild by Jack London. It was about a dog torn from domestic comfort and forced to survive in the brutal wilderness of the Yukon. Klaus saw himself in that dog, torn from everything he had known, forced to adapt or die, slowly discovering strengths he did not know he possessed. The book was difficult. His English remained imperfect. He had to use a dictionary for every other word. But he persisted because the story gripped him, because Buck, the dog, did not give up, and neither would he. Friedrich had moved beyond primers entirely. He was now reading American newspapers, slowly working through articles about the reconstruction of Europe, about the trials at Nuremberg, about the new world emerging from the ashes of the old. He kept a notebook where he wrote down unfamiliar words and their definitions. By the end of his 60-day program, that notebook contained over 2,000 entries. 2,000 English words he had not known at the start. 2,000 new ways of thinking about the world. The graduation ceremony for Klaus's group took place on a bitter cold morning in early February 1946. The prisoners assembled in the mess hall, which had been decorated with both American and German flags. The presence of the German flag surprised Klaus. It was not the Nazi swastika, but the older German tricolour, black, red, and gold, the colours of the Weimar Republic that had existed before Hitler, the colours that might exist again in whatever Germany emerged from occupation. The camp commander spoke first, his words translated into German by one of the prisoners who had completed an earlier session. "You came here as enemies," the commander said. "You leave as students. We cannot undo what happened in this war. We cannot bring back the dead or rebuild the cities that were destroyed. But we can choose what happens next. You have learned English. That is good. But more importantly, you have learned that learning itself is valuable, that minds can change, that enemies can become, if not friends, then at least people who understand each other's words." Then Lieutenant Colonel Alpheus Smith, who had overseen the program since its inception, stepped forward. He held a stack of certificates. Each prisoner who had successfully completed the course would receive one. A simple piece of paper declaring that they had studied English, American history, and the principles of democratic government. It was not a pardon. It did not erase what they had done during the war, but it was recognition that they had taken a step towards something different. When Klaus's name was called, he walked forward to receive his certificate. Lieutenant Colonel Smith shook his hand. The gesture was not perfunctory, it was genuine. A clasp between equals, not between captor and captive. "Your English is very good," Smith said. "You have worked hard. What will you do when you return to Germany?" Klaus had thought about this question for weeks. Finally, he answered in careful English. "I will teach. I will help rebuild. I will remember what I learned here, that words can heal, that enemies can change, that peace is possible if we choose it." Smith nodded, his eyes bright. "Then you have learned the most important lesson we had to offer. Go home. Build something good." Klaus returned to his seat, clutching his certificate. Around him, other prisoners wiped tears from their faces. These were not tears of sorrow, or perhaps they were, but mixed with something else. Relief. Hope. The profound emotional release that comes when a person realizes they have survived not just physically, but spiritually. That some part of them remains intact despite everything that tried to destroy it. Friedrich received his certificate and immediately asked the instructor for one more book. Something difficult, he requested in English that was now nearly fluent. Something that will challenge me. The instructor smiled and handed him The Great Gatsby. "It is about the American dream," the instructor explained. "About what happens when we chase things that cannot make us happy. About the difference between what glitters and what truly has value." Friedrich accepted the book with reverence. Even Otto Schneider received a certificate, though he took it without meeting anyone's eyes. He had never fully participated, had never abandoned his contempt for the program, but he had attended every class, had completed every assignment, and Klaus had seen him, late at night, reading his primer by candlelight when he thought no one was watching. Whatever internal war Otto was fighting, it was not over. but the fact that he fought it at all suggested that the seeds planted by simple English words had taken root even in the rockiest soil. The prisoners who graduated from Fort Getty were among the first to be repatriated directly to Germany. They boarded ships in February 1946, bound for the devastated cities of their homeland. Klaus stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the American coast, watching the land recede into the distance. In his bag, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from sea spray, he carried the books that had been given to him. Goodnight Moon, The Call of the Wild, his primer with its simple lessons about democracy and freedom, and his certificate, signed by Lieutenant Colonel Smith, declaring that he had successfully completed the course of study. The Germany Klaus returned to in March of 1946 was unrecognizable. Dresden, his hometown, had been obliterated by Allied bombing. The magnificent architecture he had known as a child existed only in memory. His family home was rubble. His mother and sister had died in the firestorm. His father had disappeared on the Eastern Front and was presumed dead. Klaus had nothing. No family, no home, no clear future in a country that had been divided into occupation zones by the victorious powers. But he had English, and he had books, and he had learned that these things could be enough to start again. Within weeks of his return, Klaus found work as a translator for the American occupation forces. His English, while not perfect, was far better than most Germans could offer. He helped facilitate communication between American officers and German civilians. He translated documents. He taught basic English classes to other Germans who wanted to work with the occupiers. At night, in the rooms he rented in the skeleton of what had once been a boarding house, Klaus continued to read. He worked his way through The Great Gatsby, which Friedrich had given him as a parting gift. He found a battered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird in an American military library and read it despite understanding only half the words. He discovered that reading in English created a space in his mind, separate from the horrors he had witnessed, a space where justice and compassion and human dignity still existed, even if only on the page. Friedrich's story followed a similar trajectory. He returned to Munich to find his home destroyed and his wife and children missing. For 6 agonizing months, he searched through displaced persons camps and refugee centers, following any lead, no matter how slim. Finally, through an aid organization run by American Quakers, he received word. His wife and daughter had survived. They were living with relatives in a village that had escaped the worst of the bombing. His son had died of tuberculosis in the winter of 1944, but 2 of his 3 children lived. It was more than many could say. Friedrich reunited with his family in September of 1946. His daughter, Liesel, now 9 years old, did not recognize him at first. He had left as a Wehrmacht soldier, certain of victory and German supremacy. He returned as a hollow-eyed man who spoke English words in his sleep. But he was her father. And slowly, painfully, they rebuilt their relationship. Friedrich found work teaching in a school that the Americans had established. He taught German children English, using the same picture books and primers that had been used on him. He taught them not just vocabulary and grammar, but something else, the idea that language connected people rather than dividing them, that words could build bridges between former enemies. In 1948, Friedrich received a letter from America. It was from Margaret Anderson, the instructor who had given Klaus her son's copy of Goodnight Moon. She wrote to tell him that Thomas had survived the war in the Pacific, that he had come home, that the family was whole again. She asked about Friedrich's family, about his work, about whether the English lessons had served him well. Friedrich wrote back immediately, his English now polished and confident. He told her about his daughter and wife, about his son who had not survived, about the school where he taught. He thanked her for the gift she had given him. Not just the English language, but the reminder that humanity persisted even in the darkest times. Margaret and Friedrich maintained their correspondence for decades. They never met in person. The distance was too great, the expense too prohibitive, but their letters crossed the Atlantic regularly, carrying news of children growing up, of careers advancing, of a world slowly, fitfully healing from its wounds. In 1973, when Friedrich retired from teaching, he received a package from America. Inside was "Goodnight Moon," the very copy that Margaret's son Thomas had owned as a child. The pages were worn, the binding loose, but the book was intact. A note from Margaret explained, "Thomas wanted you to have this. He said that if it helped a German POW remember his own humanity, then it served a greater purpose than just putting one little boy to sleep." Klaus's path took a different turn. After several years working as a translator, he used his English skills to secure a position with a German publishing house that was reprinting books that had been banned under the Nazi regime. He helped translate English works into German. He brought Charlotte's Web and The Little Engine That Could, and dozens of other books to German children who had grown up knowing only propaganda and hate. In 1952, he married a German woman who had also lost everything in the war. They had 3 children. Klaus read to them in English every night, the words of his former enemies becoming lullabies for his own sons and daughters. In 1965, Klaus was invited to speak at a reunion of Fort Getty graduates in Rhode Island. Several dozen men who had gone through the program made the journey back to America. They were older now, greyer, their faces lined with the experiences of 2 decades of rebuilding. But when they entered the classroom where they had once struggled to pronounce simple English words, they were transported back to that liminal time between war and peace, between who they had been and who they would become. Lieutenant Colonel Alpheus Smith, now retired and elderly, attended the reunion. He embraced each former prisoner, asked about their families, their work, their lives. When Klaus's turn came, Smith gripped his shoulders and looked into his eyes. "I knew you would do something good," he said. "I saw it in you even then. The hunger to learn, the willingness to change, that is what we hoped for. Not that everyone would become American, but that everyone would remember that change was possible, that the future did not have to repeat the past." Klaus struggled to respond. His English, though fluent after 20 years of use, still failed him in moments of deep emotion. Finally, he managed. "You gave me more than English. You gave me hope when I had none. You treated me like a human being when I had stopped believing I was one. I cannot repay that debt, but I have tried to honor it, by teaching others, by building instead of destroying, by remembering." The reunion lasted 3 days. The former prisoners shared stories of their lives after the war. Some had become teachers, like Friedrich and Klaus. Others had entered business, politics, medicine. One had become a prominent architect, rebuilding German cities with designs that emphasized openness and light rather than the imposing monumentalism of Nazi architecture. Another had founded an organization dedicated to reconciliation between Germans and the Allied nations. All of them, in their own ways, had taken the lessons learned in that barracks classroom and used them to create something new. On the final evening, they gathered in the same mess hall where they had received their graduation certificates 20 years earlier. Someone had located a copy of The Little Engine That Could in English. Friedrich, whose English was now impeccable, read it aloud to the assembled group. Grown men, grandfathers, some of them, listened to the simple story of determination and hope. And when Friedrich reached the final page, where the little engine successfully crested the mountain and declared, "I thought I could, I thought I could," there was not a dry eye in the room. Hans Dietrich, who had wept over that same story in 1945, spoke quietly. "My son Peter never got to grow up, but I have grandchildren now. 3 of them. I read to them in English and in German. I tell them about the war, about what happened, about the terrible things we did, and the terrible things done to us. But I also tell them about the American guards who taught us to read picture books, who treated us with kindness we did not deserve, who believed we could change. I tell them that hatred is taught, but so is compassion. That if an enemy can become a teacher, then anything is possible." The documentation of these long-term outcomes validated what the architects of the program had hoped. The prisoners who went through English instruction at Fort Getty and similar facilities did not become perfect Democrats overnight. Many struggled with the complexities of building a new Germany from the ruins of the old. Some faltered. A few, like Otto Schneider, never fully abandoned their old beliefs, dying bitter and unrepentant. but the majority took what they had learned and used it constructively. They became the foundation of a new generation of German leaders who rejected militarism and embraced cooperation, who learned, slowly and imperfectly, to be neighbours rather than conquerors. The story of German POWs learning English from picture books is not a tale of miraculous transformation. It is not a narrative where evil men suddenly became good through the power of simple words. Human nature is more complex, more resistant to easy redemption. But it is a story about the power of education to plant seeds, about how treating enemies with dignity can create possibilities that violence never could, about how the simplest tools, a primer, a picture book, a patient teacher, can accomplish what weapons cannot. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Years after the war, a researcher conducting oral histories with former POWs asked Klaus what he remembered most vividly about his time at Fort Getty. Klaus, by then an old man with grandchildren of his own, thought for a long moment. "What I remember most," he said finally, "is the first time I successfully read an entire page in English without having to look up a single word. It was from The Call of the Wild. The dog, Buck, had just realized that he could survive in the wilderness, that he was stronger than he knew. And I realized that I was reading about myself, that I too had survived, that I too was stronger than I knew, not strong in the way the Reich taught us, through domination and violence, but strong in a different way. Strong enough to admit I had been wrong. Strong enough to learn from my enemies. Strong enough to change. That moment," he said, sitting in a classroom in Rhode Island in the winter of 1946, reading English words written by an American author about a dog in Alaska, "that was the moment I became myself again. Not a German soldier, not a prisoner. Just a man trying to understand the world through words on a page. And those words, simple as they were, showed me that understanding was possible, that redemption, however incomplete, however imperfect, was not beyond reach." The picture books and primers used to teach German POWs have long since disappeared. Most were worn out through use, their pages becoming too fragile to survive. A few exist in archives, preserved as historical curiosities. But their real legacy lives on in the thousands of men who learned from them, who carried those lessons home to a devastated Germany and used them to build something better. Who taught their children and grandchildren that language could unite rather than divide? That enemies could become, if not friends, then at least people who spoke the same words. In the end, that was the quiet victory of those English classes, not the defeat of Germany, which had already happened on the battlefield, but the defeat of the ideology that made Germany's descent into horror possible, the ideology that said some people were superior to others, that violence was strength and compassion was weakness, that the world was divided into masters and slaves, with no room for equals. The simple act of teaching German soldiers English, of treating them as students rather than animals, of giving them children's books and asking them to read, contained within it the complete refutation of everything the Nazi regime had stood for. And the prisoners knew it. That is why they wept, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming recognition that they had been lied to, that the world was different, larger, more complex, and more hopeful than they had been taught. That peace was possible. That understanding could bridge even the deepest hatreds. That a picture book about a little engine that could was more powerful than all the propaganda of the Third Reich. The morning Klaus Brenner left Fort Getty to return to Germany, he stood at the gates and looked back at the barracks where he had spent 60 days learning English. The building was unremarkable. Wooden construction, basic amenities, nothing special. But within those walls, he had undergone a transformation as complete as any religious conversion. He had entered as a prisoner, convinced that his cause had been just, and his defeat merely a temporary setback. He left as a student, aware that his cause had been a lie, and his defeat a liberation. He thought of Matthias, his brother who had frozen to death at Stalingrad. He thought of all the men who had died believing in Hitler's promises of glory. He thought of promises of Samba, the millions of civilians, German and otherwise, who had perished in the inferno of total war, and he made a promise. He would remember them. He would honor them, not by perpetuating the hatred that killed them, but by building a world where such slaughter became unthinkable. He would use the English words he had learned, the picture books he had read, the simple lessons about democracy and freedom, to ensure that Germany never again marched toward such darkness. It was a promise he kept, as did Friedrich, as did Hans, as did hundreds of others who passed through those classrooms and emerged changed. They were not perfect men. They made mistakes. They struggled with guilt and grief and the enormous weight of rebuilding from ruins. But they tried, and in their trying, in their stubborn insistence that learning mattered, that understanding mattered, that words could heal, they proved that even the most hardened hearts could soften, that even the most fervent believers could doubt, that even enemies could learn to speak the same language. The legacy of those English classes extends beyond the individual lives they touched. It became part of the foundation of post-war German democracy. The men who learned English in POW camps became teachers, translators, administrators. They facilitated communication between occupiers and occupied. They helped draft constitutions and establish institutions. They taught new generations that cooperation was strength, not weakness. That admitting error was courage, not cowardice. That the world was better when people understood each other's words. And somewhere, in an archive in Rhode Island, there remains a photograph from a graduation ceremony in February 1946. 61 German prisoners of war stand in rows, holding certificates. Their faces show a mixture of emotions: pride at completing the course, sadness for everything they had lost, hope for what might come next. And if you look closely at those faces, you can see something else: the faint trace of tears recently wiped away. The evidence of men who had wept, not from despair, but from the overwhelming discovery that they were still capable of learning, still capable of changing, still, despite everything, fully human. Those tears, shed over picture books and primers, over simple stories about dogs and trains and boys who did not give up, were perhaps the most powerful victory the Allies achieved. Not the destruction of the Wehrmacht, not the occupation of German territory, but the transformation of German hearts and minds. One English word at a time, one picture book at a time, one simple lesson about democracy and freedom at a time, until men who had been taught to hate discovered they could learn to understand, until enemies discovered they could speak the same language, until prisoners discovered they could become students, and in becoming students, become human again.